Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones. The unvisited ones. The cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome to the show Huw Lemmey. Huw is a writer and the co-host of one of my very favourite podcasts, Bad Gays, which is a show that looks at a different bad or evil gay in history. Huw joins us today to talk about the importance of history and how ideas like homosexuality have changed over time. Enjoy. Huw, welcome aboard.
Thank you for having me.
Well, yes, except we weren't supposed to be doing this over Zoom. This was supposed to be an in-person discussion, but I think that's maybe where we should start. How are things, Tell people
Yes.
where you are and what it's been like.
I live in Barcelona, in Catalonia, and it's been quite intense here. It's one of the worst hotspots, I think, at the moment, second only to Lombardy for the increasing death rate, for example. I think it's doubling every 2 days. So, the virus has hit quite hard, and we've gone into an even stricter lockdown. So for the last 3 or 4 weeks, I've only been allowed out of the house to go to the supermarket. So I've been out, I think, 3 or 4 times in the last month. And it's starting to have a bit of an effect in terms of cabin fever. But I'm also trying to get myself into a sort of daily rhythm. Other than that, I think it's quite hard on other people in the city. I mean, it's a very densely populated city, and I think that the virus is spreading quite quickly, and I guess strange times. Yeah,
that's true. So, what's the process for when you go to the supermarket? Because that seems to have changed in different places. I don't know, because I've been stuck on the farm since I got back, but apparently there are sort of painted lines on the floor. And do you have scheduled times you can go in? Because it's, as you say, it's densely populated, and if that's the only place you're allowed to go, surely it's a bit of a crush. I don't know.
It's not too bad, actually. I mean, there are a few large supermarkets, but most people have like a sort of mini supermarket in their neighborhoods. So there's a couple near me, and it's quite a working class neighborhood. So I think people are buying more regularly than they might otherwise. People aren't just doing a big shop. We're allowed in 5 at a time. Obviously, old people over 65 are allowed in first without queuing, and then the rest we queue outside. But it's also, I think, the nature of sort of Catalan society is quite good at this sort of self-organization. So there doesn't appear to be, it's not very strict. There's not people sort of telling you what you can and can't do. And also there's quite a lot of mutual aid going on. I think the local shopkeepers have organized for a volunteer service where people are delivering food to elderly residents so they don't have to leave the house. And that's all done just on a credit system, just on good faith.
And spontaneously organized amongst actual humans. That's really nice.
Yeah, and also there's a sort of community spirit in terms of, I think maybe you've seen the videos from Italy of people sort of singing from their balconies and stuff. That's like really regular here on my street. There's a guy who plays his accordion every couple of nights on his rooftop, and another guy who sort of sings either opera or Robbie Williams songs from his balcony most afternoons. And then at 8 o'clock every night. No, it's just a gay city.
Yeah, true.
No, but it's and every night at 8, everyone comes out onto their balconies, and there's a round of applause for the medical workers, and people sort of chant various political demands, about rent strikes and et cetera, So that's like encouraging in terms of it's encouraging in terms of like a form of political organization when people are trapped inside, but it's also encouraging in terms of just a sense of morale, that you don't feel like you're in some Mad Max future. You feel like you're in some sort of still functioning social society.
Hmm. And what are you doing to not be crazy? Asking for a friend, because I thought, I mean, I'm very lucky. I live on 5 acres, so I can get outside when
Oh,
it's
that's nice.
raining.
Yeah.
You know, that's really good, but I can't go anywhere, and there's still it's not quite. I mean, we have a cabin, but it's not quite cabin fever. But yeah, woo.
I take a bit of time every day to like look at the horizon, because I found in the first week or two my eyes were going a bit funny from just staring at the sort of near walls. I have a cocktail every night at 7. I think maintaining some sort of routine is probably key, like getting up in the morning, getting changed and stuff.
Oh yeah.
And
Well, are you sure? Like you actually do, like, you work from home as well, so you're familiar with the work from home clothing, surely. So do you get it?
well, I've always been pretty good actually at getting up and getting dressed, because otherwise, like I'm sort of habitually lazy and also prone to depression. So actually, just that has been a habit of mine for a few years of just having to do that. Otherwise, I will just spend all day in bed.
Yeah, fair enough. That's yeah.
But also, I think I've taken up the piano. I'm trying to learn the piano.
Yeah, that'll do
So
it.
yeah, so I'm spending sort of half an hour a day just practicing piano, which is it gives me something to look forward to. Yeah, it's nice.
Oh, cool. All right. It's I think I get up and, I mean, it's low key cold here, so I get into the business sweats at some point. But yeah, the routine still stays. I've actually been, with the nature of the kind of stuff that we talk about on the show and on the site and so on. I get very busy during apocalypses. So this has been. I look at people trying to find things to do in their house, and I'm like, I actually need a break. But I will be. It's funny, like you talking about spontaneous mutual aid, which is the right kind of it. We sort of have that here, but we have a very nanny state interventionist government. Australian politicians, something, I don't know, compensating for a lack of geopolitical power, are somehow worse. They sort of kind of head in this overmanaged tyranny. So it's no more than 2 people assembling at once, and ridiculous laws about the spaces, but hair salons can stay open. They were closed, now they're open, but they have to be 1.5 meters. Each chair has to be 1.5 meters away from the next, and it's just yeah. I mean, by the time I actually get to leave the farm, there will be nowhere to go.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I think in the UK they're having a similar experience. They've got this sort of mythology of the Blitz spirit, but I don't really know how it plays out. I think there are sort of mutual aid networks going on, but I think there's also a lot of this people quite liking being told what to do by the government, and there's a lot of people calling the cops on their neighbors and stuff.
Yeah, I find that gross. I don't know what's going on there. I don't much care for it. But it is generally people who say things like Blitz spirit, or have biographies of Churchill on their shelves, tend to be the ones who will pitch the curtains about stuff like that, I guess.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Which sort of is the topic of conversation once we move into it. But we have a traditional, although we're now on a second or third question here, traditional first question: were you a weird kid?
Yeah, I was a weird kid, but largely because I feel like the sort of place I grew up was extremely conformist and monocultural. And I think I was just this sort of general precocious kid.
And so where was that growing up? Where?
I grew up in Cumbria, which is in the very northwest. It's like a very rural area in the very northwest of England, right on the border.
Yeah, we used to, we would do weekends and long weekends there. It's very pretty, but I can see it might have been an interesting place to grow up in the sense of not being interesting.
Yeah, it was a very beautiful place to grow up, but nothing was happening. So and yeah, I was just a general sort of really into art, really into history, quite very nerdy. And then I came out when I was quite young, which was not particularly easy in my school. I think that had a big effect on me at the time.
Well, so I think all gay kids are kind of weird kids. There's a growing sense, before you can articulate it, of difference from the majority of friends, typically, and so that it does kind of get caught in there. But if you came out early as well, yes, you would have been weird.
Yeah. Like I think I was reasonably normal, and then you get thrown into weirdness by coming out, and your life changes a lot. You lose a lot of friends, and then you have to find new friends. So you sort of maybe cultivate other aspects of your weirdness because you have friends who are also weird. So stuff like queer movies and things like that, and sort of you get thrown into a new social group, I guess.
Yeah. So not weird in the sense that you grew up in a haunted house, because Cumbria is actually famous for some very good and sometimes quite scary folk tales, and occasionally some UFO activity. So you didn't
Yeah.
get any of that kind of stuff?
No, I do get a lot of that sort of stuff. I grew up. My mother and my grandfather were Quakers, so I was raised as a Quaker, and my parents actually were wardens of a Quaker meeting house. So I grew up in a Quaker meeting house, isolated in the middle of a very dark woods, and there were strange. There was a strange environment. I guess I'll say there was like a sort of like presence of history that was extremely strong. The meeting house was one of the first sort of purpose-built meeting houses in the sort of early 18th century, and with with a yew tree in the yard and this sort of thing. So and there was also it was in this very sort of isolated valley, which still maintained a lot of sort of folk traditions, I guess.
Cool. I could see you put a yew tree in front of, because funny, the Quaker ritual is very similar performatively or behaviorally to spiritualism. So you stick the tree of the dead in an old building in sort of like the isolated parts of Cumbria. This is how you get ghosts, I guess.
Yeah. And I just also I think also because Quakerism started in Cumbria, well, Lancashire, but what is now Cumbria, in sort of in the South Lakes. So there was very much like a sense of the presence of like the earliest days of the religion, which were to me historically were extremely different to the way Quakerism presents now, and that was sort of always present. And then also just the link, I guess, of growing up like very deeply in the woods. As a kid, I spent every weekend with my brothers isolated, just playing out. We just kicked out of the house and go and play in the woods. So also a very different relationship towards nature. And then these sort of village folk traditions of there was this place called the Green Hut, which we used to go to for there's an organization called Watch, which was like a sort of nature scouts, basically like a sort of nature watching group for kids. And we also used to meet in the Green Hut, and we'd also have all our Halloween traditions there and bonfire night and things like that, which was this old tin cabin out in the woods, which had a haunted piano in it. So there was those sort of
that's cool.
Those sort of like quite intense like local traditions of with it, which was still like pretty pagan in their own way, of people dressing up and fires and apple bobbing and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So one of my next questions was going to be why history, but I mean, is the answer to that, well, because I grew up in it, and so I don't know. I'm trying to solve or find something like why such a resonance with history? Do you think?
I don't know why, but I know exactly how I feel about it, which is this awareness of its presence at all times. Like a sort of a sense of historical imagination that I feel slightly haunted by myself, which is, I find it very hard to not be contemplating or thinking or experiencing what happened in a place in the past whenever I'm there. I find it very hard to be in a house and not think about all the people who previously lived in that house, for example, which I think probably comes from growing up in that area, and especially in that particular house where, the stories sort of built into the architecture quite strongly. Literally in terms of dates and names carved in various parts of the house, and parts of furniture and stuff around the house was quite a big thing. It had all this original furniture from when it was built, this Quaker furniture. I used to sleep in what had previously been the women's gallery, because for a while the men and women were separated for worship. And then when they stopped doing that, they converted that into a bedroom. So that was my sort of childhood bedroom for a while. And I had this, like, it was all very, dark wood and little leaded windows. And like, there was just, I don't know, it was just like an extremely strong sense that, that you were living in a borrowed space. So I think that's carried through, and that tends to still be my experience whenever I'm in any sort of space, which is a sort of extrasensory relationship with the people who've used that space before.
Yeah. Do you? I love that, because it's something I'm in resonance with. I'm idly wondering, as I'm sure a lot of listeners are, what your chart looks like. But do you get a sense? So, for instance, if your childhood bedroom was the women's gallery, depending on when it was converted, and I think this about the front half of the farmhouse was from 1885. So I'm in the master bedroom. This is my office now, and I get that weird sort of animus sense of, did the house have an awareness that it was going to be this? And for instance, was your childhood bedroom a bedroom for longer than it was a women's gallery? And in if that's the case, what is it? Do you know? I think that with things like shipwrecks, I did a video about the Japanese support fleet that was sunk in Shuk Lagoon, because half the boats weren't even in the Imperial Navy until the war, so they weren't even in the Navy, and they've actually been reefs for longer than they were ships, because they've been down there for longer than they were sailing. So are they reefs or are they ships, right? And this is the kind of stuff, like, you can't not do history if it appeals to you, I guess, is where I'm going with that.
Yeah. It's something that it's not something that I sort of feel like I have an academic interest in any way. It's like a much more experiential aspect of, it's unavoidable to a certain extent of my daily life, I guess I'd say. And now living in Barcelona, I feel that even more, because there's like a new history to sort of discover, but I also feel like I kind of understand it even without having done any of the research or reading around it.
It's because you have the well, in an indigenous context, it would be a form of knowing that is feeling, right? So he's dead now, but like a very wise Aboriginal lawman called Bill Naiji, and he has a very little book called Story About Feeling, and it's this whole discussion of the kind of like non-empirical epistemologies and how everyone has them, but we've just pretended they're not there, but they are there.
Yeah, I think so. And for me, like, I'm probably coming from this sort of perspective, like an understanding of urban space or something. But I feel like you're informed quite strongly by the architecture. Like, the architecture has evolved in relationship towards these human beings, and I feel it very strongly here as something very supportive and comforting. Like, I really enjoy being within the city, because especially in the old city, it's a very lived-in city. It's one that has a very strong, interesting history, but it's not one that preserves it in aspect in any way. It's one where people live inside their history and accept that the buildings are, going to continue to change and evolve with them, which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah, that's it puts it in flow. I was a member, you may well have been as well, but living in the UK, I was a British Museum, English Heritage, National Trust member. You couldn't find an organization like that I wouldn't, and usually because I like the maps and the books, and we would go and see all this stuff. But there's really interesting critical discussions happening around the tyranny of the mowed lawn and the kind of cult of the ruin, and that most of these organizations that are charged with keeping these things accessible, keep it accessible in that Gothic painting way, where you're supposed to encounter nothing but a ruin and not touch it.
Yeah, and almost like there is no more history to be had. I think it's quite a reactionary position in the UK, which is like, things aren't going to change now. We have history, and then we're just maintaining things as they are. Whereas, I guess maybe because of its more recent history in Spain, there is more of a sense of that willingness to change and live inside your history.
Yeah, the notion of what the past is, and as you say, where it is or if it begins, like structures and footpaths and buildings are still in time, they're still in use, and use is almost too violent a word for it. They're still going along in the journey of human experience, rather than being sort of paused with a manicured lawn as like this is a ruin. This is from this is an old abbey, and then we had Henry VIII, and now it's a ruin, and that's it.
Yeah, and then of course, because also within Barcelona, particularly, it's a very interesting urban history because it was a very tightly packed medieval city that sort of was stuck to its perimeter walls right up into the 19th century, and then there was this thing called the extension, Eixample, which is like one of the first major planned grid cities on that scale of that era. So you have this incredibly tightly packed warren of medieval to sort of 18th century, what would have been sort of slums, and then around it this enormous grid, absolutely vast grid, sort of 5 or 6 times the size of the old city. That was planned by one man in one go and has largely been kept to his original plan, although the shapes of the buildings and stuff have sort of changed according to capitalism's needs, I guess. So you get this very strong contrast as well between these two modes of city living, which can be really exciting.
Yeah.
And then lastly, of course, the Sagrada Familia, which is like this very strange protuberant sort of outgrowth within the city, which also has this very weird relationship to history because it's essentially a medieval cathedral process being built, you know.
Yeah. It's a great town. I've only been a couple of times. I was looking forward to actually spending a few days there, but life is life, I guess. But speaking of history, you are the co-host of one of my very favorite podcasts, Bad Gays podcast. For people who are listening, it's in the show notes. So question the first on that is, why the show? Like, how did it come to be?
It's an idea that I'd had for a little while, and then I was talking to my friend Ben, who's a proper historian, an actual qualified academic historian, about it. And he said it sounded like a great idea, so we sort of went into it together, and we sort of have built the structure around that. And the basic idea of it is that so much of the popular history of LGBTQ people for the last 30 or 40 years has been, well, for the last 100 years, in fact, has been about digging through history to rediscover gay stories that are positive, which is natural and a good thing. You know, it's like a reaction to the demonization and the pathologization of LGBTQ people. So you find these like positive stories, and they tell you that there's always been these sort of behaviors, and that it's something we can be proud of, and great people have done great things, which is all well and good, and we're not in any way against that. But we thought, actually, there's also all these stories of fascinating, interesting characters from history who were actually terrible people or did terrible things. So we wanted to use that as a way to then reconstruct other ideas around what it means to be gay specifically, because the first 2 seasons we focus mainly on gay men or bisexual men, and actually use that as a way to tell the story that homosexuality is like a constructed idea. And so we go back through history to look at these sort of guys and what made them gay, or can we call them gay? And that raises all these questions. And we basically use those amazing stories that are compelling in their own right to then sort of hang these extra questions on about all sorts of aspects of gay history or gay identity. So, for example, we talk a lot about men who adopted like extreme masculinism as like part of their sexual identity, and how that contrasts with like some ideas about gay identity today and the problems with that, and how that links to, for example, the far right in Europe in the 20th century and things like that.
Well, those are some, like, I am a bit of a, it's weird, we grew up in other sides of the world, but you said a few things. I remember in like the Gordon of Khartoum episode, what you studied, well, in school, you were taught about the charge of the Light Brigade twice, but you didn't hear about the Opium Wars. And because some of the towns in Tasmania are from around the times where Gordon was an imperial hero, we have towns that are named things like Khartoum and Baghdad, and what all roads that are named after these events. And so there's this flip side of it, and I had no idea. I had no idea that I knew for good and righteous post-colonial reasons that he was at the very least problematic, and frankly an example of a very dangerous and hyper-racist warmonger. But I also didn't know that like he falls into that mask for mask trap.
Yeah, although with Gordon with Khartoum, like as with many of these people, it's very hard to unpick the idea of what them having a sexual identity at all, because it was still in an emergent phase at that time. When he was young was when, he was probably, when was he born? So I guess he was probably in his sort of 20s or 30s when the word homosexuality was invented. So obviously this is like the very early days of sexology. And also then how that interacted with very bourgeois Victorian ideas around the way that you do present your sexuality, or you do present anything to do with sex. So actually, like, ideas of masculinity were much more important than ideas of of male sexuality, perhaps.
Yeah.
And also for me, I think with we get perhaps where mine and Ben's interests meet is that I'm very interested in like the way that the English have constructed male homosexuality, which seems to me like quite unusual. I think you do get very distinct regional types of homosexual behavior or homosexual identities. And today, obviously, like the US has this as a sort of cultural megalith, has this draw around ideas of male homosexuality. But I think in the early 20th century, English homosexuality had a very different tones. And then Ben has sort of similar interests, I guess, within German constructions of masculinity. So, and both of those revolve heavily around ideas of colonialism. Ben points out, I think, in one of the early episodes, that the word homosexuality and the first anthropological organization in the world were formed in Berlin in the same year. And the ideas around male homosexuality are really based around colonial ideas of wild behavior, let's say. And so that was they were really tied together as projects. The sort of suppression of homosexuality and colonialism had like very, very strong links, which makes it doubly interesting that so many people who were like key figures within the colonial project were either homosexual, bisexual, and strongly oriented towards men, or perhaps what we might today call queer, have some sort of queer expressions of their sexuality. So not just Gordon of Khartoum, but Lawrence of Arabia, and probably Cecil Rhodes. They all have these exhibits, sort of aspects of what we probably today call homosexual behavior.
Or other things. I mean, the scary bit, the Gordon of Khartoum thing, and to some extent Lawrence of Arabia. So for people who don't know, which I certainly didn't until I listened to the episode, when he was in China, essentially adopted. It was in China that he adopted like street boys to come and live with him as,
Oh no, it was back in England.
Oh, it was in England.
It was after after he came home from China, he was sent to become a sort of surveyor of forts around Kent and the mouth of the Thames, which he hated. But he had a big house out there, and he adopted these street boys to come and live with him, and which was, I think, unusual behaviour even for the time.
Yeah, and that, I mean, it's not evidence of anything, but it rarely ends well if you set up your own Neverland Ranch. Like, eventually the stories come out.
Yeah, and that's actually with Gordon of Khartoum is probably the closest we've got to some sort of understanding of his sexuality, is that although there's no evidence that he was engaged in sexual relations, he definitely had some sort of caring role that he was playing in these guys' lives that was perhaps not entirely legit by today's standards, or even standards at the time. But one thing that's really interesting about him, which I think is also really tied to this English construction of masculinity and homosexuality, is this stiff upper lip, face of like resilience in the face of horror. He was famed for going into battle in just after the Opium Wars, when he would go to battle just armed with his rattan cane. He would lead his troops from the front, and that's sort of tied to this sort of extreme sexual repression that he was also going through at the time, which I think is probably clearly linked to the idea of how do you manage an empire when you have to perpetrate these extremely horrific acts upon the people that you're colonizing.
Yeah. And that's exactly where.
Yeah, does that make sense?
It's exactly where stiff upper lip comes from.
Yeah, and I think he's also characterized by this extreme self-hatred of his body. He had a death wish purely because he hated living inside a body. And a lot of his ability to undertake these so-called amazing feats as an imperial hero was because he had very little fear of death, because he was really looking forward to the time when he could be free of his body.
That is and that's one of the things, like, because we sort of touched on it, like, what is gay historically speaking, but you look at that, it's to pop psychologize that if someone hates their body, and they never married and it became suspicious and they shacked up with a bunch of street boys and what have you, you're like, look, the circumstantial case isn't great.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I find
so that's why we include it. And we include, sorry.
No, you go.
I was going to say that now that's why we include a lot of guys who maybe weren't homosexual in their actual behavior at all, or for example, in the current series we've just done, Nikolai Yezhov, who was the head of the NKVD, and actually we don't know if he was gay at all. That was a big part of his indictment when he was executed following the Great Purges by Stalin. But we don't know. We don't actually know if he was gay, but he's an interesting figure to talk about in his relationship towards homosexuality in the Soviet Union. So a lot of these people, like, it's a jumping off point. And by the end of each episode, we always discuss, were they bad and were they gay?
Yeah, and that's really important, like, because gay, as you say, is like, it's a modern term. So when we look back, I mean, what's a good way of thinking about that? I know the shorthand on the show is basically like, before there was gay, there was sodomite, and that's kind of true, but it's narrowly true, and that's why I find the episode so refreshing, because I think there's you said nice things about the kind of like modern gay project of looking back through history for good examples, but that's still a fraught process, because it's quite jingoistic. You're making a contemporary cultural claim by avoiding all the bad ones.
Although there are people who do the same thing, like there's the historian Richter Norton who doesn't shy away from dealing with some of the bad guys in the past, but he still makes the claim that homosexuality has been an eternal and immutable aspect of human existence, whereas the claim that we sort of make is that homosexuality is a Victorian invention. If there were no homosexuals before the Victorian era, in the same way that there were no heterosexuals, as a subjectivity, as a way of thinking about sexuality, that is an invention that's useful for us and was useful for Victorians, but isn't this immutable thing. You know, human behavior is, and that categorization of human behavior is part of a sort of colonial project of
exactly.
Of sort of empirical observation of behavior and of creating taxonomies of human behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can look for patterns of behavior or acts, and even that shifts and moves along in the flow. So one of the things that I think is that seems to come up a lot, my favorite example being, say, James VI, right, where when he was 14, he basically fell in love with his cousin, and they appear to have had a sexual relationship, and his cousin was something like 24. And you look at that now and you think, so, okay, James VI was gay. That's not my first reaction when I'm listening to that episode. It's like, wait a minute. And the same thing, I mean, I guess it's very royal. Like, I think one of my favorite episodes is Frederick the Great, and he fell in love with the other pupil in his math class from memory, who was like not much older, but like a decade older kind of thing, something like that. And I think that's super interesting that we're talking about homosexuality being, and correctly so, part of the imperial project as a categorization, like sort of the very European and almost quintessentially British Natural History Museum idea. The refrain I use here is like, it's sort of pinning butterflies on the corkboard. It's everything, every specimen with every little label kind of all reality, right? But yeah, it's interesting that when you look back through history of people who become dead guests on your show, it's not just that you sit with the tension of having a modern sexual identity and looking for familiarities in a historic process, but it's also that there are parts of it that are the wrong kind of familiar, which I think is interesting, and they're common.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I also think that an aspect of it I find interesting is, and some of the aspects we get criticism for, which is the idea that therefore it doesn't matter that these taxonomies are created, but that and therefore it doesn't matter. And yet I still think there can be value in understanding and identifying with those taxonomies, even understanding that they are created and they can fluctuate, through history. And so for the same reason, I think it's interesting to look back. Ben's always says, like there were no homosexuals before the 19th century, but quite often I then riposte, yeah, but come on, James VI was so gay. I think that's interesting to look at those. Yeah, and that does shed light upon how homosexual identities were created. The behaviour of Frederick, for example, can be seen as like a very early manifestation of like a lot of sort of slightly femme aspects of gay identity that were to emerge sort of 100 years later. And that the gay people who were looking back into the past to help create a positive aspect to gay identity in the 19th and 20th century, who recognized this behavior in themselves and wanted to look back, were therefore creating a gay sense of gay culture and gay identity through being an audience to a historical type of character, I guess. And I think that's really interesting, which is that homosexuality is obviously understood as like a sexual taxonomy, but actually it's a hugely cultural thing. And so gay people identify with each other through all sorts of like these other aspects of a shared created culture that don't just come from a shared sexual disposition. And what are the historical basis of that,
Yeah.
I find it fascinating that people today, or people in the 19th century, did identify so much with Alexander the Great or with Hadrian or with Frederick the Great, for example. What were they finding in those behaviors they recognized in themselves? And it wasn't just that they wanted to have sex with men.
There is something, there are some archetypal overlaps, fraught term, but I'm going to use it, between the lives of someone like Hadrian and Frederick and to a lesser extent James, but it's there if you look for it. One of the ones that I think is potentially trauma, that's certainly there for Hadrian, but I distinctly remember the Frederick the Great episode when his father kills his lover, this guy from the... who was actually in the Royal Guard or whatever it's called for the king in Prussia. When he kills him, he holds Frederick's eyes open to watch it. That's. I think there are certainly amongst older gays listening. There's parental non-acceptance, and then there's what Frederick had to go through. Which is an attempt at
correction, right?
Yeah.
It's an understanding of like a conversion therapy, and the idea that Frederick's father clearly understood that he thought that it was a phase that he could change, which is the same that like most gay people over the age of probably 25 have all been through, and people continue to go through, obviously. Is this idea that people do think that you can be disgusted or shamed or horrified or traumatized out of some of your sexual tendencies.
Yeah, an amazing point. I mean, he's called Frederick the Great for a reason. In terms of royals, he did a lot of royal things correctly, like expanded territory and all the rest of it. But you think that's got to mess you up. Like, I'm going to build a fruity pink palace. But I just think, history's valuable and traumatizing.
Yeah, I think the Lawrence of Arabia in episode is very interesting for similar reasons. The way he processed not just his sexuality in these sort of colonial terms, but then dealt with the trauma of sexual violence that he went through in a way that is legible to people today who are involved in BDSM.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Because he was he probably suffered some sort of gang rape while he was being held by the the Ottomans during the First World War, and he then seemed to have been processing that later in a sort of sexually violent relationship that he consented to with a guardsman called Jock, or who he called Jock, who he would then have a sort of strange role-playing relationship with, where he would write to this guy in the character of his own uncle, demanding certain punishments and asking for Jock to reply, writing about how he experienced them, how Lawrence of Arabia experienced them, which is just, to me, like a totally fascinating way that he dealt with his trauma and that he seemed to be conscious of and processing in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have, like, we find these kind of familiarities that are illustrative and in the kind of great, and this is sort of a wishy-washy statement, but it's nevertheless a kind of true. That's one of the medicines that history offers, is that you can kind of find yourself in it. So it's a personal question, like, because I have a memory of this. Do you have a memory of the first time you saw, like, yourself in history, and as well as the first time you weren't in it? When I was in high school and we were doing ancient Egypt, there was a pharaoh, I can't remember which one now, who gave up his rulership because he didn't have any kids, to his general and his lifelong companion when he died. And this is just as I'm working out in the back of my head what's going on with me. And I knew exactly what that was. And it wasn't written in there. And it certainly doesn't mean it was like a modern gay relationship. This is anachronistic anyway, but not that you'd find on a sitcom. This wasn't like a modern family thing. It was... but it was quite clear, because the thing is, if you're a pharaoh, it's the same with a king. You can have whatever you want. So if you have a proclivity for like one-armed 9-year-olds, that won't be an issue. And he didn't have any kids, and he didn't appear to have been married except to a goddess. And he left the kingdom to his friend and the head of his army. And you go, I remember reading that and encountering that in high school and going, this is interesting. Do you have a memory like that?
No, I don't think specifically historically to do with homosexuality. I think because I came out when I was like 13 or 14, so I think it was much more like pop culture related at the time. Like I had one of my first sort of sexual experiences shortly after George Michael had been arrested, and which was, when was that? Sort of 98, I think, and so I'd been 11 or 12, and he. I had and then people started calling me George Michael as like their bullying nickname. And I didn't know anything about George Michael at the time. And so I sort of, I don't know how, maybe it must have been on the internet, I guess, researched it, discovered what he was up to. But then also I remember having a strong feeling that his response to that, which was so strong and so positive, was something that gave me a lot of support and made me feel like it was okay. But I don't particularly remember, I think because I was at that sort of young age, having a those historical understandings of my homosexuality in that way.
Yeah, for me it was that one, and that kind of stuck with me until hitting university and doing communications, where it's very much about history as a contextualized way of seeing the world in and of itself, and that was kind of off to the races. But I just had that distinct realization we existed before, even if the terms didn't.
I mean, I had that in negative ways, I think, but quite strongly. Like the sort of queer coding of both the villains and weak people within sort of Hollywood movies in history, which I was always interested in. Historical films was very strong for me. You know, I remember very clearly over the age of sort of 10 or 11, understanding that. Is it Edward II in Braveheart? The son of Longshanks. He's who was Piers Gaveston's lover, and him and Piers Gaveston appear within Braveheart, and he's queer coded as a useless, effeminate homosexual.
So that's the thing about. Yeah, that's the thing when Ben says that gay doesn't, it's true enough, when it doesn't exist prior to, homosexual doesn't exist prior to the classification in the 19th century. Cool. That's a good example, because also it's interesting to see who ends up as a guest and doesn't, because people would say that, for instance, Julius Caesar was not, we would say gay, but what they actually meant was he was a passive participant in anal sex with another man, because that's always been a thing. So it's weird, even if homosexual is a modern scientific term, there are aspects of it that nevertheless perennial, and it's that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and then the same, for example, within ancient Greece, and in that there was nothing forbidden about men having sex with men, but for a man to be a passive partner to a younger man, for example, was very shameful, and that's been inferred throughout history. So yeah, like the death of Edward II, which is there's no evidence, I don't think, for this except from maybe like a passing remark within a chronicle later about him being killed with a hot poker up the arse. But that's just passed into history. It's just a truism, you know, and that was clearly understood at the time, and since as a sort of reference towards him being a passive partner with Piers Gaveston, which was obviously understood when Gaveston was around, that he had too much control, presumably because he was the dominant partner.
Mm. One of the other more fun, in a way, perennials, I think, is, and I'll turn it into a question, Huw, what's the evil twink? Follow-up question, are all twinks evil, or just most of them?
That came up in one of our earliest episodes, I think, in relation to Oscar Wilde and to Bosie, his younger lover, and this control that Bosie seemed to have. And that Ben remarked was strong evil twink energy, which sort of caught on, I think, because people do recognize it again as like a literary and maybe historical type, and also a thing from their own life. I don't know, like, I'm always a bit more cynical about it, because I think there's like other things at play here, which is like, I guess it's implied within twink, but it's to do with people who are reaching middle-aged suddenly becoming enamored with the youth of others, which I think for gay men in the past has been like a easier thing for them than maybe to recognize and fall into, or perhaps a thing that is because I think like heterosexual men have clearly always had similar impulses around the midlife crisis, right? And divorce and getting a young girlfriend or something, and it seems this sort of tragic thing with them. But I think with gay men, I don't know, there's this other historical aspect of them being somehow, I think it's quite a sort of maybe offensive, but them being under the control of these younger men. Yeah. And yet it is a historical continuity, you know.
So it would seem, yeah. The Bosie one, God, what an asshole! Like,
yeah, like that's a good example. Like he really was like a real selfish jerk, and I guess the aspect there, which is that everyone can recognize this person wasting or crashing their talent into the ground for the love of somebody who was nowhere near as talented or as interesting a person, and that's the tragedy that I think people identify with. Yeah.
The evil twink is real. I think it's definitely historically real. Do you have?
But it's not just young. That's not just like young, attractive people. Is that a twink specifically? Is that not just a thing?
That's what I'm saying. And it's not just all twinks. It's like a half joke thing, but there is definitely an archetype.
It's a precocious sexuality where you suddenly, as you reach young adulthood, you become aware of your sort of sexual currency, but you haven't necessarily matched some of the other life skills or around empathy to really control that in a way, so you can become quite exploitative around the fact. But we shouldn't miss out the fact that there is also an inverse of that, which is Oscar Wilde should have known better. You know, the people who date evil twinks should know better, and should understand that this person is not going to like necessarily wield the power of their sexual attractiveness with much thought for others.
Evil twinks aren't for dating, Huw. That's where he went wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Do you have? I mean, I'm sure you get asked this a bit, but like, do you have a worst historical gay? And do you think out of the ones you've looked at, who was like the worst?
Roy Cohn, without a doubt. I don't know why Roy Cohn over J. Edgar Hoover, because J. Edgar Hoover clearly had more power to do worse things, but there's something about the way that Roy Cohn maneuvered and manipulated that was so deeply purely evil. Yeah. For those listeners who don't know, Roy Cohn was a lawyer who was involved intimately in, first of all, the Lavender Scare, which was a predated the Red Scare, but it was sort of McCarthy's campaign against homosexuals in the sort of US state. And then he was involved in the Red Scare, and then he went on to become Donald Trump's lawyer, and he was deeply corrupt and deeply malevolent, and seemed to love power, like wielding power for bad, purely on its own terms. You know, he enjoyed being feared and hated to a certain extent, and also helped perpetrate sort of deeply homophobic acts through the Reagan administration, whilst himself suffering from he was HIV positive, and then he died of AIDS-related illnesses, which he at all times refused to admit that he was that was the life he led. So yeah, Roy Cohn. I don't know, something about him. I mean, I'm sure that's probably informed by his portrayal by Al Pacino in Angels in America,
which is magnificent. Like, yeah,
really, really excellent. Yeah,
yeah. No, that's good. All right. Yeah, I was really looking forward to this chat because I've been listening to the show for ages. I think you guys do a great job with it. Do you take requests? Like, are you going to do Aleister Crowley?
Yeah, we do take requests. Actually, we're always looking for new people. So I think he's on the long list. We have some great people coming up, both on the long list and also in the upcoming season, which is airing at the moment. So I'm really looking forward to some of those coming up.
Nice one. So how do people find out about that? And also what else you got going on? Because you have some well, actually, are you telling people about your book news?
Yeah. Well, first of all, if people want to find it, it's on badgayspod.com, where you can listen to all the old episodes. And there's also T-shirts now. We've got Evil Twink Energy T-shirts.
Oh, nice.
We're hawking.
Yeah.
But then on top of that, I do like a weekly essay subscription service where I write sort of an essay a week for subscribers, or an essay a month for free subscribers. So I put a lot of my energy into that at the moment. And then I have a new book coming out hopefully sometime this year, although I don't know how coronavirus will affect the publication schedule. But that's a sort of collaboration between me and Hildegard von Bingen, which is to say I've sort of interpreted some of her cosmological writings into a novel, which is going to come out with Ignota Books.
That's going to be so good. So she's we are big fans of her around here. The premium members in the Saints course have deep dove into a bunch of her things, her music, her sort of perspectives on stuff. So I wanted to save that to the end to be like, dangle that for the next time. But so it's Bad Gays Pod, and where do people go to get the newsletter?
It's huw.substack.com.
Oh, you got your first name .substack. Well done.
Yeah, I got it early. Yeah, I've been doing it for about a year now, and it's going quite well. Like, it's nice to have like a group of people who are specifically interested, and you can sort of go a bit deeper into some of the things you're interested about. So I write a lot about history and public space and on that as well.
Well, excellent. Well, as I said, amazing show, really good chat, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the episodes of this season, and thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
Very good stuff. As it's Holy Week, I wanted to see if I couldn't stretch the Easter story metaphor, to see if I could get it to work with this week's episode subject, something about how Jesus hung out with prostitutes and outcasts, so you should too by listening to Bad Gays or something. Yes, it's not my best work, but you should definitely check the program out. Magically operant people might be interested in the James VI or Alexander the Great episodes to begin, but check it out regardless. Shows like Bad Gays hit right in the chaos magic feels. It's about history, all right, but done in that illuminating, historicizing way where you simultaneously learn something very useful about today, like how evil twinks have been humanity's true enemy from the very beginning. Until next time.